You're listening to The Conversation. Our story starts in the shadow of Mount Buffalo, in Australia's remote alpine high country. It's 3.5 hours from Melbourne, and the rain is sheeting down on an off-grid property at the end of a long gravel lane. It's late August, and the place is crawling with heavily armed Special Forces officers, and a helicopter buzzes overhead. They're searching for a man called Dezi Freeman, who's alleged to have just shot 2 police officers dead and injured a third. Freeman is a skilled bushman and has disappeared into the remote national park of Mount Buffalo. It's full of caves and old mine shafts, and as the days and weeks now pass, there's still been no sign of him.
Night and day, police have not stopped in their hunt for alleged police killer Dezi Freeman.
There's been a dramatic raid in the high country this afternoon as Dezi Freeman remains on the run 2 weeks after that.
The army has been called in to help track down accused police killer Desmond Freeman.
The thing about Dezi Freeman is he's a so-called sovereign citizen, someone who believes they're not subject to the law.
We've seen evidence of the more serious side of sovereign citizen threats recently, but this is a story which is a little bit friendlier, a little bit more eccentric.
The friendlier story is how the sovereign citizen movement found its roots in Australia. In the 1970s, a man called Leonard Casley, a disgruntled wheat farmer, declared his property a micronation, refused to pay his taxes, and then crowned himself the prince. I'm Gemma Ware from The Conversation, an independent news and analysis platform partnering journalists with academics to help bring research knowledge to as many people as possible. Welcome to The Conversation Weekly, where experts explain how we ended up here. Kieran Hardy, you're an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University in Brisbane, where you research counter-terrorism and countering violent extremism. You're currently doing research into sovereign citizens as part of your work into conspiracy-fueled extremism since COVID, and you spend a lot of time watching videos of sovereign citizens and their interactions with police. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
So it's 1970 in a small farm in Western Australia, and a man called Leonard Casley is declaring himself head of a new micronation called Hutt River Province. Tell us about him.
Yeah, so Prince Leonard is a bit of a character. Prince Leonard, well, just Leonard Casley as he was to start with, was a wheat farmer, and the Western Australian government put in some pretty strict wheat quotas to avoid oversupply of wheat. So he had a huge farm and he could only supply a small amount to the government, to the sort of general stores of wheat. And they did that, they announced that very quickly. And so he'd already grown the wheat, they'd already done their growing and they couldn't plan for it. And then the government pulled the rug out from under them and said, no, you can only supply this small amount. So he was left with an oversupply of wheat. He didn't like it. He fought the government on these wheat quotas. And his response to that was to declare his own micronation and to secede from Australia. Just outback Australia, a big farm, an endless road to get there. It's about 500 kilometres north of Perth, which is about in the middle of nowhere as you can get. And drive in, there's some sort of signs up. There's a giant stone head that was carved out of rock by a Canadian artist, like a bust of his head. And then when you get into the town, there's a post office, there's a souvenir shop, you can get your passport stamped.
What kind of person was he? What was he like?
Imagine like a very friendly old man. From all the footage that you've seen, they had a nice family, but felt very strongly about the government imposing these quotas and the kind of control that the government had on him, and came up with a sort of ingenious solution as to break off from Australia. I shouldn't say that he officially broke off from Australia. It was recognised to some extent by the tax office, but it is more of a quirk of the system that he says he has seceded from the country. And there's a whole sort of series of honours and royalty, so that there was a Royal Academy of Research. He has the whole sort of princely get-up.
Welcome to the Principality of Hutt River. I'm Prince Leonard, and this is Princess Shirley. We welcome you all.
All the outfits, there's a sword that he'll use to don people with honours of the kingdom. His wife, Princess Shirley, and then he gave out honours to all his kids and titles as well. So it was like they considered themselves a royal family. And so there was a whole system around this belief that they were their own country separate to Australia.
How was he viewed in Australia?
I think it's been one of those old stories that people sort of heard of, but people didn't necessarily pay too much attention to in my daily experience until it started coming up more with this trend towards sovereign citizens today. And then, like amongst most people, you would hear the story and think of it as a bit eccentric, that he was generally a well-meaning guy who just stuck it to the government. And I think people in Australia sort of like that type of a story, that he fought for what he believed in.
What happened to him?
Eventually, the courts cracked down and said, we actually need to chase this guy because he hasn't been paying tax for so long.
For half a century, a tiny enclave has remained fiercely independent from the rest of Australia.
And this was just before 2017, getting towards the COVID era. So the combination of COVID with a court decision which said that you have to pay back your taxes, and the bill was about $3 million. But he passed away in the midst of it. And then the debt passed on to his son, and in the combination of COVID and all the challenges of that, the family eventually decided to declare the province back within Australian governance, so no longer a micronation.
The end of a dynasty. The House of Casley is no more.
So at the same time as Casley is declaring a micronation, there's a growing anti-tax movement in the US in the 1970s. What arguments were they making?
So the two things in the US that really started around the time of the 1970s as well was anti-tax protests, and this is in a time of economic recession in the United States, and then also a group called Posse Comitatus, which believed that their county shouldn't be subject to laws any higher than the local sheriff. So there is a history of that in US law. But this group was more of a far-right, extreme Christian, white supremacist type group with anti-Jewish and conspiracy theory views. So it was probably the melding of those two things, anti-tax protests in a time of recession, with a local early militia type group with far-right views. And the combination of those two things really bred into this sovereign citizen or pseudo-law type movement, which has quite a lot of similarities across countries.
So these ideas about anti-tax movements, they spread out beyond the US. Did they take different forms in different places?
I suppose what characterises the sovereign citizen movement is an interesting combination of local diversity or local adaptation and evolution, combined with still quite a lot of consistency across the board in the types of arguments they make. So in Canada, there's a movement that they call the Freeman on the Land movement or the Freeman movement. And that's more of an anti-tax Canadian version of it. And then in Australia, now we're seeing more strict anti-government type measures or responses or beliefs. And then in the US, you get a more militia style version of it as well, particularly when you involve firearms and relating back to the militia movement in the early 1990s.
So you've mentioned that in Australia, at least, these micronations were viewed as a kind of an eccentricity. Were they always viewed that way in other places, or were there places where there was an undertone of violence?
I think the US is the most obvious place where you've seen undertones of violence. It starts as anti-tax protests, and you might have greater legitimacy to an anti-tax protest in the remainder of the population. And then you start getting more division and more violence when we start getting into the early 90s militia movement, the Waco siege.
The flames may be out, but a firestorm of controversy rages on after the assault on the Branch Davidian compound.
So the Waco siege was a tragic event in US law enforcement history, where in 1993 you have a cult, the Branch Davidians, who, in a similar way, I suppose, to this idea of a micronation, hold themselves up in their own property and consider themselves running their own way of life. And eventually there was an initial raid on the property. About 10 people were killed, including officers and Branch Davidians. And then after that initial shootout, the FBI came in and took control of the operation, but it turned into a 51-day siege of the property. And eventually the Attorney General gave the order that rather than just negotiating, that the police could raid the property and enter. And there are different versions of what happened, but however it happened, a fire started in the property and burnt the place to the ground in about an hour, and about 80 people were killed, including about 20 children. And the Oklahoma City bombing was 2 years to the day on the anniversary of Waco.
A massive car bomb exploded outside of a large federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, shattering that building, killing children, killing federal employees.
Timothy McVeigh, the main offender who most people would know from receiving the death penalty for the Oklahoma City bombing and probably the most sort of public face of it, was a young military veteran. He was very unhappy with government. But Terry Nichols was the other who was prosecuted, and he was a known sovereign citizen, and he had engaged in what people call paper terrorism, which refers to the act of sovereign citizens really harassing people, government agencies, businesses and so on, with repeated legal claims that basically have no basis, but they'll try to put liens on property and do all this kind of pseudo-legal stuff and harass, send letters to police agencies endlessly and all that kind of thing. And when the Oklahoma City bombing happened, initially it just seemed like an unrelated, they didn't know why it was happening, but eventually law enforcement twigged that it was the 2-year anniversary of Waco.
Fast forward to the 2020s and COVID-19 and lockdowns around the world. What did that do to the sovereign citizen movement?
It provided a massive spark for sovereign citizen beliefs. It's probably the first time that a lot of people in their lives were really subject to the law in a direct way. Everything that we do is subject to the law. But for most people going about their daily lives, you're not told by police officers what to do. You're not in a situation or a confrontation over some belief. But what we had with lockdowns, vaccine requirements, mask mandates and so on, was that people were being told very directly what to do by government in a way that directly impacted on their lives. And I'm not commenting on the sort of benefit of those measures or not. It was just a feature of the time that everyone, pretty well around the world, was subject to requirements that were very out of the ordinary. People were being told that you can't do the things that you ordinarily do. And especially when you have a belief system around freedom and individuality and the things that we took for granted in our everyday lives, that we have those freedoms to go to the shops and do whatever it is we want to do, go to an event we enjoy. And when those things were taken away, people got very angry. And then that came out in these sort of, it was a perfect sort of storm, as it were, for sovereign citizen beliefs to come to the fore in those sorts of anti-lockdown freedom type protests. Whenever people are under financial pressure, when their livelihood is being threatened in some way, you have a wheat farm that you use to make money to help your family to live, and then a lot of that gets taken away from you by some government decision. You have that during COVID, and when you start having very uncertain times, people look to explanations for what is happening, and often simple explanations that feed into your existing hatred or emotional state. You feel uncertain, you feel like you hate the government for what they're doing to you. You can find information online that will help you feed that feeling. And I think that's why we saw the rise of a lot of conspiracy theories in that time as a way to understand what was happening in the world.
You say that COVID added fuel to the sovereign citizen movement. In Australia in particular, what happened and how did it grow?
I suppose similar to around the world, we had anti-lockdown protests. There was a convoy to Canberra, which was a large grouping of people that descended on Parliament House in Canberra, in our capital.
A man with a loaded rifle has been arrested after police dismantled a gathering of protesters in the nation's capital.
And that was a real mix of your sort of 5G conspiracy theorists, your anti-vaxxers, your sovereign citizens. The other thing in the mix are those far-right or more problematic groups in terms of violence who can see a situation like that and want to exploit it and want to gain membership and recruitment. So the mix of people and interests and grievances in some of those anti-lockdown protests is not so simple as just people are opposing lockdown. It's the rise of conspiracy thinking more generally. You have far-right actors in the mix as well. So I don't think the sovereign citizen problem can be viewed in isolation. It's sort of one element of that sort of anti-government sentiment and sometimes extremism during that time of COVID.
And what about now in the US and Canada? What situation are we seeing now with the sovereign citizen movement?
In the US, there's still quite a high capacity for conflicts between sovereign citizens and law enforcement. There was one recent study that tracked deaths in the United States of law enforcement officers going back to the 1980s until recently, that included 27 deaths of law enforcement officers from sovereign citizens. So I think in the United States, at least compared to Australia, I think there's a greater capacity for individual interactions to turn to something more violent. And in the US, with that history of the militia movement as well, that is something distinct from Australia, where we've had somebody sort of secede from the country, Prince Leonard, a bit more eccentric. But that's not as worrying as a type of militia who might have greater access to arms and some kind of territory or hole up somewhere. And then in Canada, there's been another similar story, I suppose, in terms of eccentricity of so-called Queen Dodulo, who believes she is the Queen of Canada. And she's had a whole bunch of followers follow her in RVs, caravans, up and down Canada, driving around following her. People are paying large amounts of money to her through sort of tithing arrangements of a certain percentage of their income. And the people are sort of, to give up your life and start following around a leader is a very different type of situation. So the type of influence that these so-called gurus can have on people that's more like what we're getting into a cult type situation, which I think has more potential for harm to the individuals following that person.
Every week, Michelle Grattan offers you a ringside seat to the latest in Australian politics with interviews and insights from political insiders. On the Conversations Politics with Michelle Grattan podcast, we cut through the spin and get to the substance with independent analysis of the issues that really matter. Stay informed, search and follow Politics with Michelle Grattan wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back. Kieran, you've traced the history of this movement for us, but what do we know about the types of people who adhere to or use sovereign citizen-style arguments today?
There's only a small number of empirical studies and data that would tell us who are sovereign citizens in terms of profile or demographics or anything like that. But the data suggests, and anecdotally and from media reports, we do tend to be dealing with sovereign citizens with an older population, so maybe say 30 to 50 years old, tend to be male and tend to have existing strong grievances against government, which often can result from some initial dispute or grievance. So you will see, and we've seen this in some surveys we've run as well, strong anti-government beliefs or previous evidence of disputes. We've seen more likely to have a previous criminal history, at least for minor offences. So you can start building up a picture of who a sovereign citizen is more likely to be. I think what that means is really that where you have a population with existing grievances against government, high, what we call legal cynicism, believing the law is illegitimate, that the system's out to get them and so on. If you have those underlying beliefs over a long period of time, combined with, say, a trigger event in their life or some other kind of dispute with government, that they can then search out this information online, find it very readily, and then start being influenced by it to a higher degree.
In your work, you've been looking at police body-worn camera footage of some of the interactions that sovereign citizens in Australia are having with officers. Can you tell us about some of the things you've seen from watching some of that footage?
What we've seen in the footage probably confirms a lot about the types of profiles that we've mentioned around people, an older population, grievances against government, a lot of intersecting disadvantage. These are not necessarily ideologues with a sophisticated belief system around anti-government ideology. They're often people who are down and out, as it were, facing multiple hardships in their lives. For example, they might not be able to pay their car registration. They might be driving a very old vehicle and they're getting pulled over for not paying their registration, and police are trying to, say, repossess their car or their house or something like that. And sovereign citizen ideology provides a potential, in their mind, provides them with a strategy to get out of those obligations, and this leads to lots of confrontations with law enforcement.
What kind of language and arguments are coming up in these confrontations?
You will hear the Magna Carta a lot watching videos about sovereign citizens. Honestly, it is hard to understand the significance of many of the arguments. But essentially, I think all of these arguments come down to a sort of wanting to return to original ideas of law before an illegitimate system of government was put into place. And they have a strong belief that the governments now are a corporation that replaced the original legitimate government, And the trick to get out of the obligations imposed by this government today is to say that you do not wish to enter into a contract with them. And so that's why you get all these phrases like, I do not wish to contract with you today. I do not consent to these orders. And that's all based on this conspiracy theory that at some point in our history, in our case, the Australian government was replaced with a corporation. Another common thing you'll hear in arguments with police is, I do not have an ABN, so an ABN is an Australian business number. But that's very, very similar to the original US idea that the United States, as founded by the founding fathers, was replaced at some time in the US history by a corporation that is controlling everyone. So, like I said, you get these local versions of it, but a very similar story. And so you will get people claiming all these types of legal instruments and what we call pseudo-law arguments, like pseudoscience. And that, I think, is where a lot of people dismiss sovereign citizen arguments as gobbledygook or nonsense and so on. I actually think the bigger problem with the ideology is that it involves half-truths from the law. They're drawing on legal ideas like jurisdiction, sovereignty, consent, contract, all these things. They're not made-up words or made-up concepts, but they're applying them in situations which make no sense or do not the correct way to apply them or the correct context in which to apply them.
So we've gone from micronations like the Principality of Hutt River, as you said, essentially viewed as eccentrics and not a real threat to government, to law enforcement, to people using sovereign citizen arguments with violence and coming into violent confrontation with police. What's next? Where does this lead?
That's a really good question. I am worried about the rising discontent in the population more widely. Just on the weekend past, we've seen large-scale anti-immigration rallies in Australia.
Thousands of Australians marched in the streets, clashing over immigration, race, and what it means to be Australian.
I think the specific, very harmful, dangerous events like we've seen in Victoria with the shooting of 2 police officers, I would hope that would continue to be in the vast minority. But what I'm more worried about, generally speaking, is, in addition to that capacity for violence in individual cases, the broader discontent in the population, that we will see anti-immigration rallies attended by a combination of sovereign citizens, neo-Nazi groups, and a range of interests in their conspiracy theorists. So I think sovereign citizens is one element of what I'm worried about, but it's the combination of these ideologies and the growing discontent as we see in rallies and protests that can tip over into violence.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Kieran, for sharing your expertise on this. We appreciate it.
No worries. Thank you very much for having me.
That's it for this week's episode of The Conversation Weekly. This episode was written and produced by Mend Marawani and me, Gemma Ware, with production assistance from Katie Flood. Sound design is by Eloise Stevens, and our theme music is by Nita Saul. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us directly at podcast@theconversation.com. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please support us at donate.theconversation.com, and please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. Thanks for listening.